Agent Husko joined the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund in April 2014 after a 30-year career with the FBI. He also holds a law degree from Temple University. He has served in many roles, including undercover in complex financial crimes and violent crimes. But it must be said, he's also served both on the Jackson and Chicago SWAT teams.
I just got hit with that broad brush.
I said there are exceptions.
He's also served important roles in Salt Lake City, in Torino, in the Italian Olympics, the World Cup, national conventions, during 9/11 Hurricane Katrina. I could go on and on. I do think it bears mentioning that he was also awarded the FBI's Shield of Bravery for his actions during a violent random kidnapping. And so with that perfect contrast, Agent Husko.
So, good evening. It is a joy to be here tonight. We're here for a reason. And I suspect in large measure that reason is Ferguson and it is Eric Garner and are the events of the last almost 6 months. So I think it's important to put some context to our world today, to our situation, and as my colleague did, I will share some of this through my own lens. Because my own context has changed about 9 months ago. I started my career in Mississippi in 1984, and it wasn't long after I arrived in that assignment that I had my gun drawn on a local sheriff in a corruption case. We had watched him take a payoff, put the cash under his leg, and 4 of us approached him in his car and took him into custody. I also worked civil rights cases in Mississippi, and aggressively so, where we had strong evidence of a different sheriff taking a young man into custody. He believed the man was involved in a robbery, and I do believe that they took him for a ride on an old logging road, got out his dry cleaning bag from his uniform, put it over that young man's head, and proceeded to beat him into the car. Scared him badly enough that they didn't have a case to prosecute him, but they scared him enough to chase him out of the state. And it was incredibly difficult for us in the U.S. Attorney's Office to try to bring that young man back so we could find justice for that sheriff. I went on in my career to work for a number of years in Chicago, worked violent crimes there, and saw firsthand the corrosive effect of poor law enforcement by some. And I like to think that some was relatively few in number. In the 90s, where we hit a time when conviction after conviction, life or death sentence after death sentence was being overturned on young, generally young, relatively young people in the community who had allegedly confessed to crimes, most commonly murder, and DNA was coming into its own, and DNA analysis was proving that that person was not the murderer. And shortly after I left Chicago in the late 90s, close to 2000, the governor of the state had decided to commute the sentences of people on death row. And beyond the commutation of those sentences, there was a bigger effect on the Chicago Police Department because they found themselves in a situation where their officers testifying about a confession and their tactics were not being believed in court, so they were losing cases. And they hit this part of this cycle where more and more people would make those allegations. Whether the allegation was true or not, it worked in court. So they struggled, and often in important cases where they couldn't make the case because increasingly in Cook County, their testimony was being disbelieved because all you had to do was read the headlines. And the headline screamed, Chicago police are corrupt. Of course, as Ray averred, there is corruption in law enforcement. It's incredibly unfortunate. I went on later in my career to oversee much of that counter-corruption effort in the FBI, and sadly we arrested far too many state and local law enforcement officers, and occasionally federals as well, on corruption charges. Where you would see police officers involved in protecting drug transactions, drug deals, drug cartels. And it is incredibly troubling. That being said, and I talk in terms of context, I left the FBI last April and had very clear views about law enforcement in our society, had an understanding of corruption and the really incredible negative impact on our communities, on trust, on the bonds of trust that we have to have for law enforcement to do its job. And I will, because Maria has this nice little pentagon, I will make reference to it. She was kind enough to put it up, and I think it has an important role in our discussions. After I left the FBI, I jumped to a position in a nonprofit. And from time to time, the mission of our nonprofit is not only to support the role, the righteous role of law enforcement in our society today, but also to occasionally defend individual officers who have been accused of a crime. And that is an important role, and I see it as important in conversations about Ferguson, about Eric Garner and the NYPD, and other facets of our society. And certainly it's important to you in this room, I hope it is, as we talk about and as you discuss the rule of law and the importance of the presumption of innocence and burdens of proof and important amendments to our Constitution that hopefully guide police officers' actions and guide your actions and thought processes as young attorneys in the near future. So my own context has changed. Recently, this past summer, we undertook an effort to help defend a young officer out in the state of Utah. He was engaged in this drug surveillance in a white supremacist area of their town, saw what he believed to be a drug transaction, encountered this young lady who he thought was the buyer. In fact, it turns out that's exactly what they had seen. As they tried to beckon her to roll down her window so they could engage her in what had just happened, she refused. He started to go back to his car to get out a device to break out her window and ask her to come out of the car. She put the car in reverse, hit the gas, and as he was about to be struck, he was firing, as was his partner, and took her life with one of his shots. That young officer, who had a young family, was indicted for manslaughter by the local DA. And after we and others undertook some steps to defend him, a judge threw out the manslaughter indictment at a pretrial hearing, saying there's a lack of evidence, that you cannot make this case to the DA's office. That happens from time to time in our world. And as I try to put the events of the last 5 or 6 months into my new perspective, from my current position, I'm compelled to look at these violent encounters with police across our country and try to dissect what is the meaning. Why is this happening? Are we connecting dots that should be connected or should not otherwise be connected? And I'm troubled with, and I have been vocal about some of the rhetoric in our country today. It is unfortunate. It's disappointing. In some respects, it's very predictable. If you dig down and look at the raw numbers of actions of police towards the citizens where they take someone's life, you can make your own determinations about how big of a problem that is. Part of my concern is in the last 6 months the community and the media and some vocal actors have fanned up unduly criticisms of the police, connected things together that are not necessarily connected together, and in many ways demonized our police with that broad brush. Unmistakably, some police officers need to be smacked with that broad brush and run out of the profession. Unmistakably. But as educated people in this room, I assume that is everybody in this room, it is incumbent upon us to pick through the facts as we can discern them and really get to the details. To understand what's going on in our society, to look at what the media says. I brought a media friend here with me tonight because it is important for thoughtful people to push aside or pick through media biases or individual biases and make your own determination based on the fact. I am troubled by where we are in our bigger discussions about law enforcement today, and I'm troubled by it in a couple of ways. Apart from this kind of civil rights use of force discussion we're having, I hope that this group and friends and others will engage in listening to the debate about privacy today. Listen to privacy groups and law enforcement groups and national security groups. And I know the national security panel got pushed back today, but there are important conversations taking place. Those conversations relate to other three-letter government agencies that are collecting, by their nature, by their charter, large amounts of data. And within that collection is potentially some of our data. And listen to the discourse about Edward Snowden and what he alleges to be the sins of the NSA, alleges, or what others allege to be the sins of the CIA and the FBI and others and law enforcement, and try to understand how that impacts you in your day-to-day life. What meaningful impact is there? Earlier today, I had a little bit of time, and I was compelled to go down to the 9/11 memorial. And if anybody's been there recently, you look in the gift shop, and there are these little, look like Christmas tree ornaments. One celebrates New York City Fire Department, and another celebrates law enforcement. Talks about law enforcement as the angels. And I remember driving up West Street years ago in a plume post 9/11 and saw all these law enforcement supporters holding up signs, trying to give away free things. And it reminded me, coming to this forum today, how that pendulum can shift in our day-to-day or year-to-year discourse. How far we have gotten from 9/11 when the police and fire and EMS and others were celebrated as the rescuers and the heroes. And here we are having this discussion today. We need to have the discussion today. But what brought us here, what events are occurring around this time, and I encourage everyone to put into context too, that this law enforcement piece that we are discussing is not just law enforcement. It involves the courts. It involves the legislature who writes the laws that the police officer presumably was enforcing against Eric Garner. There's a law on the books. Somebody called to complain and say he's violating the law. So we need to put it in a bigger context. The Justice Department, its role. Our legislature in today's society, you know, I'm coming out of the DC area. Our Congress and our president cannot agree on what day of the week it is. And so how do we get together and talk meaningfully about privacy, talk meaningfully about bias, talk meaningfully about policing, and have the right impact? And I hope your ears and your voices will be part of that. Our legislatures are judges. The police, their job is principally to enforce the law, but they don't put sentences on people. They don't lock them up. They make the case. Juries play a role in that. Judges play a role in that. So there are bigger conversations that have to be a part of what we're discussing today. Thank you.